The Soviet Union had just spent 2 decades tearing itself apart. Revolution, civil war, famine, purges, millions dead long before the first German tank even rolled. It fought like a society that had already learned how to live with terror, hunger, and mass death. Not because it was free, not because it was unified, but because it had been hardened into something else. To understand why the Red Army could absorb the worst invasion in human history and still reach Berlin, you have to go back to what came before Barbarossa, because the Soviet soldier of 1941 was not born in peace. He was raised inside a machine that had already devoured his country once. The Russian Empire that entered the First World War possessed institutions, traditions, and a social fabric that had evolved across centuries. When the guns fell silent in 1918, almost none of that remained. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 opened a chasm in Russian history. What followed was not reform or reconstruction, but obliteration. The civil war that engulfed the former empire between 1918 and 1921 killed millions through violence, disease, and starvation. Whole classes were targeted for elimination. The landed nobility, the merchant class, the officer corps, the priesthood, and anyone associated with the old order faced execution, exile, or forced labor. Entire regions descended into chaos as red forces, white armies, foreign interventionists, peasant militias, and nationalist movements fought for control. Atrocities became routine. Villages changed hands repeatedly, each occupation bringing fresh rounds of killing. The population learned that survival often required concealing identity, denouncing neighbors, or fleeing into the wilderness. By 1921, the economy had collapsed. Industrial production stood at a fraction of pre-war levels. Transportation networks lay in ruins. Famine spread across the Volga region, Ukraine, and southern Russia. Cannibalism appeared in desperate communities. The Bolsheviks themselves faced peasant uprisings, worker strikes, and the Kronstadt rebellion. Lenin responded with the new economic policy, a tactical retreat that permitted limited private enterprise. The party simultaneously tightened political control. The Cheka hunted down opposition with methodical brutality. Show trials established the pattern of forced confessions, public denunciations, and exemplary punishment. The Orthodox Church, which had provided spiritual authority and social structure for centuries, became a primary target. Clergy were arrested en masse. Churches were demolished or converted to warehouses and workshops. Religious practice was driven underground. The intelligentsia that had survived the Civil War found itself increasingly isolated. Writers, academics, and scientists faced demands for ideological conformity. Those who resisted disappeared into the growing camp system that would eventually stretch across Siberia and the Arctic. Stalin consolidated absolute power through the 1920s by outmaneuvering rivals, building networks of loyal functionaries, and exploiting factional disputes within the party. By 1928, he launched policies that would transform the Soviet Union through coercion on a scale that defied comprehension. Collectivization aimed to break the peasantry as an independent class and extract grain to feed industrial workers and finance exports. Wealthy peasants, the kulaks, were declared enemies and deported to remote regions or simply shot. Villages that resisted had their food confiscated. State procurement brigades seized grain, livestock, and seed reserves. The resulting famine of 1932 to 1933 killed millions. Ukraine suffered catastrophically. Entire districts recorded death rates that emptied villages. Families consumed grass, bark, and anything remotely edible. International relief was refused. Stalin denied the famine existed. Those who spoke of it faced arrest for anti-Soviet agitation. Survivors carried the memory of watching children starve while state officials requisitioned the lost grain stores. Industrialization proceeded through the 5-year plans with equal brutality. Labor camps provided workforce for mining, logging, and construction in regions where free workers would not go. Quotas were set impossibly high. Failure to meet targets meant sabotage charges. Factory managers, engineers, and workers faced arrest for production shortfalls blamed on wrecking and conspiracy. The technical intelligentsia worked under constant suspicion. Innovation carried risk because new methods could fail, and failure implied deliberate undermining of Soviet power. The population learned to meet quotas through any means necessary, including falsified reports, corner cutting, and forcing subordinates to shoulder blame when things went wrong. Trust between individuals eroded. Denunciation became both weapon and survival tool. Families informed on each other. Colleagues sent each other to the camps over personal grudges disguised as political vigilance. The NKVD developed sophisticated interrogation methods that extracted confessions to fantastic conspiracies. Torture was systematic, not exceptional. Prisoners signed documents admitting to espionage, sabotage, and plotting with foreign powers they had never contacted. The Great Purge that began in 1936 consumed the Communist Party itself, the military, the state apparatus, and vast numbers of ordinary citizens caught in expanding waves of arrest. Old Bolsheviks, who made the revolution, were tried publicly, confessed to impossible crimes, and executed. The Red Army Officer Corps was decimated. Commanders who had fought in the Civil War, led divisions through the 1920s, and trained the next generation disappeared into NKVD prisons. Marshal Tukhachevsky and thousands of other officers were shot following accusations of collaboration with Germany and Japan. The purge extended through every level of command. Regimental commanders, battalion leaders, company officers, and specialists vanished. Replacements often lacked experience, training, or the confidence to make decisions without approval from political officers. The relationship between military command and party control became hopelessly tangled. Officers understood that defeat could mean execution, but so could unauthorized initiative. The safest course was to await orders, follow doctrine rigidly, and avoid actions that might be interpreted as deviation. This institutional paralysis would prove catastrophic when German forces crossed the border. The population that entered 1941 had lived through 2 decades of violence, deprivation, and betrayal. Millions were dead. Millions more languished in camps. Families had been shattered. Traditional communities had been destroyed. The state demanded absolute loyalty while treating citizens as potential enemies. Soviet society existed in a condition of permanent anxiety. People spoke carefully, avoided political discussions, and understood that any association with the wrong person could bring disaster. The younger generation had grown up knowing only Soviet power. They attended schools that taught Marxist-Leninist ideology, glorified Stalin, and presented history as a story of class struggle and socialist triumph. Many believed this narrative, or at least performed belief, convincingly enough to avoid suspicion. Others remained internally skeptical, but understood that skepticism had to remain internal. The revolution had promised liberation and equality. What it delivered was a new form of autocracy backed by industrial-scale repression. The Soviet Union's western frontier in 1941 reflected the territorial gains from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and subsequent operations. The Baltic states had been absorbed. Eastern Poland had been occupied. Bessarabia had been seized from Romania. Finland had been attacked in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, a campaign that exposed severe weaknesses in Red Army training, equipment, and command. Finnish forces inflicted disproportionate casualties before being forced to cede territory. Foreign observers, including German military intelligence, noted the poor performance. Soviet tactics appeared crude. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was inadequate. Officers seemed unable to adapt to unexpected situations. The purges had clearly damaged military effectiveness. Stalin responded by replacing commanders, reorganizing units, and attempting to address training deficiencies, but time was short and problems were deep. The Red Army of 1941 was numerically massive, equipped with thousands of tanks and aircraft, but organizationally fragile and doctrinally confused. German preparations for Operation Barbarossa proceeded through the spring of 1941 with meticulous planning and massive troop concentrations along the border. Soviet intelligence collected warnings from multiple sources. Spies reported German intentions. Border units observed build-up. Defectors provided details. Stalin dismissed these warnings as provocations designed to draw the Soviet Union into premature conflict with Germany. He believed Hitler would not attack while Britain remained undefeated. He feared that defensive preparations might themselves trigger German action. Orders went out forbidding aggressive patrolling or response to border violations. Ammunition was stored away from frontline units. Aircraft were parked in neat rows on exposed airfields. Fortifications were incomplete. When German forces crossed the border on June 22nd, Soviet units were unprepared, disorganized, and in many cases lacked basic orders for how to respond. Communications collapsed immediately. German aircraft destroyed much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the first hours. Armored spearheads cut through defensive positions that lacked coherent command structure or fallback plans. The speed and scale of the German advance in the summer of 1941 exceeded even optimistic Wehrmacht predictions. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken in vast pocket battles around Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma. Units that escaped encirclement retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment, losing contact with higher command, and fragmenting into smaller groups trying to reach Soviet lines. Wehrmacht directives suspended normal rules of war. Commissars were to be shot on capture. Partisans and suspected partisans faced immediate execution. German military planning assumed Soviet collapse within weeks, so no arrangements were made for managing or feeding large numbers of prisoners. When the quick victory failed to materialize, the prisoners remained in these camps to die. Soviet society's response to the invasion was neither unified resistance nor immediate collapse, but rather a complex mixture of shock, confusion, flight, and in some cases welcome for the invaders. In Western Ukraine and the Baltic states, populations that had experienced Soviet occupation for less than 2 years sometimes greeted German forces as liberators. Nationalist groups emerged hoping for independence or at least autonomy under German protection. Stalin's radio silence in the first days of the war deepened uncertainty. When he finally addressed the nation, calling for scorched earth and partisan resistance, the speech acknowledged reality in a way Soviet propaganda rarely did. The state that had demanded total obedience now asked for total sacrifice. The framing was crucial. This was not a war to defend socialism or the Communist Party, but a war for survival of the Russian people, the motherland, and national existence. The Great Patriotic War became the official designation, deliberately echoing the Patriotic War against Napoleon in 1812. This was not accidental. Stalin understood that ideological appeals alone would not sustain resistance. The Soviet Union needed to mobilize deeper loyalties. Propaganda began emphasizing Russian national heroes, historical military victories, and cultural continuity. The Orthodox Church, which had been savagely persecuted for 2 decades, was partially rehabilitated. Metropolitan Sergius was allowed to raise funds for the war effort. Churches reopened. Priests blessed soldiers. Icons reappeared in dugouts and tanks. The regime did not abandon atheism or Marxism-Leninism, but subordinated ideological purity to practical necessity. Russian nationalism, which had been condemned as reactionary and chauvinist, became acceptable when directed against the German invader. Writers and composers produced works celebrating Russian courage, sacrifice, and historical greatness. Newspapers published stories of heroic stands, often heavily embellished, but effective in creating narratives of resistance that soldiers and civilians could grasp. The framing worked because it connected to something genuine in the population's experience. People understood threats to their existence in ways they might not have understood threats to dialectical materialism. Moscow's survival in the winter of 1941 to 1942 was military, political, and psychological. German forces reached the city's outskirts in December. Moscow slipped into a state of raw, uncontrolled panic. Rumors spread faster than facts, that the government was fleeing, that Stalin had already abandoned the city, that the Germans would arrive within days or even hours. Ministries began evacuating, officials disappeared overnight, and crowds surged through streets and railway stations trying desperately to escape east. Muscovites tore down Stalinist posters from their walls, scrubbed Soviet slogans from shop fronts, and burned their Communist Party membership cards in the open. NKVD offices hastily destroyed files, smoke rose from chimneys and courtyards as documents, identity papers, and evidence of loyalty to the regime were dumped and burned en masse. Looting broke out around state buildings and warehouses, while fear and exhaustion boiled over into ugly scenes, including anti-Semitic outbursts in working-class districts as people searched for scapegoats amid the collapse. For several days, Moscow felt leaderless and abandoned, a city bracing itself not to resist but to survive, convinced that the fall of the Soviet capital, and perhaps the Soviet state itself, was imminent. Soviet commanders organized desperate counterattacks using reserve units brought from Siberia, troops that were trained for winter warfare and equipped appropriately. The German offensive stalled. Soldiers froze in positions without adequate winter clothing or shelter. Equipment failed in extreme cold. Supply lines stretched to breaking. The Red Army's December counteroffensive pushed German forces back from Moscow's immediate environs, inflicting heavy casualties and demonstrating that Wehrmacht invincibility was a myth. This mattered beyond the tactical level. The Soviet state had not collapsed. Moscow had not fallen. Stalin remained in the Kremlin. The government continued to function. Factories were evacuated east, reassembled, and put back into production with extraordinary speed. Workers operated in unheated buildings, often sleeping beside machines, meeting quotas under conditions that would have stopped production anywhere else. The Soviet population's capacity to endure hardship that seemed unbearable to others became strategically significant. The resumption of German offensive operations in the spring and summer of 1942 aimed at economic targets rather than Moscow. Army Group South drove toward the Caucasus oil fields and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga. The campaign initially succeeded through superior German tactical skill and coordination. Soviet forces retreated across the steppe, suffering massive casualties and losing territory. Stalin responded with Order 227, the Not One Step Back directive. The order established blocking detachments behind frontline units with authority to shoot soldiers who retreated without authorization. Penal battalions were created for soldiers accused of cowardice or desertion, sent to the most dangerous sectors to redeem themselves through suicidal attacks. Officers who presided over retreats faced tribunal and execution. The order codified what had already been informal practice, but made consequences explicit. Fear of German capture and fear of Soviet punishment combined to create conditions where forward defense became the only option. This was not inspiration. This was coercion made operational doctrine. Stalingrad became the focus of both German effort and Soviet resistance for reasons that transcended military logic. The city bore Stalin's name. Losing it would be symbolic catastrophe for the Soviet leader. Holding it became a matter of personal and political survival. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would demonstrate continued German offensive capability and possibly unhinge Soviet morale. The battle that developed between August 1942 and February 1943 destroyed the city and created conditions of combat that eliminated normal distinctions between frontline and rear, soldier and civilian, tactics and survival. German forces fought their way into the city, street by street, building by building, room by room. Soviet defenders used the rubble as defensive terrain, turning every basement, stairwell, and wall fragment into a fighting position. Close quarters combat made German advantages in air support and armor coordination largely irrelevant. Snipers operated from ruins, sappers mined approaches, small groups held isolated buildings for days while surrounded. Casualties accumulated relentlessly. Reinforcements were fed into the battle as quickly as they could be ferried across the Volga under German artillery fire. Many units suffered catastrophic losses within hours of entering the city. The psychological dimension of Stalingrad was the transformation of desperation into calculated defense. Soviet commanders learned that German forces could be stopped, tied down, and worn out through urban combat that negated their operational advantages. General Trykov's 62nd Army developed tactics specifically for city fighting. Soldiers operated in small assault groups equipped with grenades, submachine guns, and satchel charges. They moved through buildings rather than streets, using sewers and cellars to avoid German observation. Every position was contested. German soldiers found that capturing a building did not secure it. Soviet forces would counterattack from basements or reoccupy upper floors during darkness. The grinding attrition destroyed German confidence. Units that had swept across hundreds of kilometers of open steppe found themselves unable to advance 200 meters. The realization that this was winnable gave Soviet forces something they had lacked in 1941, belief that German tactical superiority was not insurmountable. The Soviet counteroffensive launched in November 1942 encircled German and Romanian forces in and around Stalingrad. Operation Uranus exploited weak points in the Axis line, held by Romanian divisions that lacked anti-tank weapons capable of stopping Soviet armor. Soviet mechanized forces broke through and linked up, trapping the German Sixth Army. Hitler's refusal to authorize breakout doomed the encircled troops. Luftwaffe air supply efforts failed to deliver adequate food, ammunition, or medical supplies. German soldiers in the pocket froze, starved, and died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper care. By February 1943, the survivors surrendered. The psychological impact went far beyond the 90,000 prisoners taken. The German military had suffered a catastrophic defeat. An entire army had been destroyed. The myth of inevitable German victory evaporated. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad represented proof that the war could be won. The tide had not just stopped, but turned. Soviet generalship evolved through catastrophic failure into calculated ruthlessness. Commanders who survived 1941 understood that their predecessors had been shot for less devastating defeats. They learned to operate under conditions where errors meant death, but so did hesitation. The successful Soviet commanders were not necessarily the most humane or the most tactically brilliant, but rather those who could absorb losses, maintain operational tempo, and deliver results that satisfied Stalin. Marshal Zhukov exemplified this approach. He was demanding, brutal with subordinates, and utterly indifferent to casualty rates if objectives were achieved. His planning incorporated massive artillery bombardments, coordinated armor thrusts, and infantry assaults that accepted horrific losses as the price of breakthrough. Zhukov understood that Soviet advantages lay in numbers, production capacity, and the ability to replace losses faster than Germany could. Skill and finesse mattered less than mass and persistence. Other commanders adapted similarly. Rokossovsky, Konev, Vasilevsky, and Malinovsky developed operational methods that emphasized concentration of force, overwhelming firepower, and relentless pressure. They learned from German encirclement tactics and applied them with Soviet resources. The Soviet approach to casualties reflected both strategic calculation and grim acceptance. Infantry attacks often proceeded with minimal preparation because thorough reconnaissance cost time and surprise. Assault units crossed open ground under fire because flanking maneuvers required coordination that less trained formations could not execute reliably. Minefields were cleared by soldiers walking through them because mine detectors were scarce and time was limited. Penal battalions led attacks across the most heavily defended sectors because their lives had already been written off. These were not accidents or incompetence, but conscious decisions made within constraints of training, equipment, doctrine, and strategic necessity. Soviet commanders faced impossible mathematics. German forces, at tactical level, often retained superior skill, coordination, and firepower. The only way to overcome these advantages was through numerical superiority applied without regard for losses. This worked because Soviet society could sustain casualty rates that would have broken other nations. The calculation was cold but accurate. The partisan movement behind German lines grew from spontaneous resistance into organized warfare that tied down hundreds of thousands of Axis troops and inflicted psychological damage beyond material destruction. Initial partisan activity was chaotic. Bypassed Red Army soldiers, Communist Party officials fleeing capture, and local volunteers operated without coordination or supply. The NKVD and military intelligence began organizing these groups, inserting trained officers, establishing communication networks, and coordinating operations with frontline offensives. By 1943, partisan brigades operated across occupied Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, sabotaging railways, ambushing supply columns, assassinating occupation officials, and gathering intelligence. German responses followed predictable patterns. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned, populations were deported or shot, hostages were executed for every German soldier killed. These reprisals created conditions that pushed more civilians toward resistance. If the penalty for passive existence was death anyway, joining the partisans became rational. The brutality fed itself. Partisan warfare imposed costs on both sides that extended beyond killed and wounded. German forces, tasked with anti-partisan operations, were diverted from frontline duties. Divisions that might have reinforced critical sectors instead conducted sweeps through forests and swamps, achieving temporary control that evaporated as soon as they withdrew. The psychological toll on German soldiers was substantial. Frontline combat was terrifying but comprehensible. Partisan warfare was ambiguous, paranoid, and endless. Any civilian could be a scout or courier. Any forest could hide an ambush. Any quiet sector could explode into violence. German troops responded with escalating brutality that alienated populations that might have remained neutral. The cycle intensified. Soviet partisan commanders understood that German reprisals served Soviet strategic interests by making collaboration untenable and resistance inevitable. Civilians were placed in impossible positions. Refusing to support partisans risked denunciation and execution by Soviet forces. Supporting partisans risked German discovery and collective punishment. Survival required choosing sides or fleeing into zones where authority was uncertain and violence was universal. The depth of suffering that Soviet civilians endured during the war cannot be adequately conveyed through statistics, though the numbers are staggering. Over 25 million Soviet citizens died. Cities were reduced to rubble, villages disappeared, families were obliterated. The siege of Leningrad alone killed over 1 million people, primarily through starvation. Residents consumed anything remotely edible: wallpaper paste, leather, sawdust mixed with flour, pets, and eventually each other. The dead were stacked like cordwood in frozen streets because the ground was too hard to dig graves. Survivors recall silence broken only by artillery bombardments and the sound of coffins being dragged on sleds. This continued for 900 days. In the occupied territories, populations faced deliberate starvation as German authorities requisitioned food for Wehrmacht use and shipment to Germany. Entire regions experienced famine as crops were seized, livestock was slaughtered, and grain reserves were confiscated. The economic planning for occupation assumed millions of Soviet civilians would die, and these deaths were factored into German calculations as acceptable or even desirable for reducing future resistance. The normalization of death and deprivation created a population inured to suffering in ways that gave the Soviet Union a strategic advantage that could not be quantified in divisions or production statistics. Soldiers fighting at the front endured hunger that would have incapacitated troops from better-fed armies. They marched through conditions that should have stopped movement. They attacked when exhaustion should have made combat impossible. This was not superhuman endurance, but rather the baseline expectation for people who had already survived collectivization, famine, purges, and invasion. The Soviet state's previous brutality toward its own population prepared that population to endure a level of violence and deprivation that exceeded what most other societies could sustain. This was not noble or heroic. It was the grim reality that suffering had been weaponized, turned into an instrument of state power that now functioned to absorb German offensive capacity and outlast Wehrmacht staying power. Soviet industrial production during the war demonstrated organizational capacity that operated despite chaos, destruction, and impossible conditions. Factories were dismantled, transported east, and reassembled in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia with speed that still seems improbable. Workers operated equipment outdoors in winter before buildings were constructed. Production began while assembly was still underway. Quality control was minimal. Tanks rolled off production lines with defects that would have stopped delivery in peacetime but were considered acceptable in war. The T-34 became the workhorse of Soviet armored forces, not because it was perfect, but because it was producible in massive quantities, mechanically simple enough for undertrained crews, and effective enough in combat to matter. Soviet industry produced over 60,000 T-34s during the war. German industry produced about 6,000 Panthers and 1,500 Tigers. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. Similar patterns appeared in aircraft, artillery, rifles, and ammunition production. Soviet factories outproduced German industry despite losing vast industrial regions to occupation and operating under constant material shortages. The labor force in Soviet war industries included women, teenagers, elderly workers, and slave labor from camps. Shifts ran 12 to 16 hours. Safety standards were ignored. Accidents were frequent. Workers collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. The state responded with medals, rations, and threats. Factories that met quotas received recognition and bonuses. Factories that failed faced investigation for sabotage. This system was brutal and inefficient by conventional measures, but it produced the weapons that Soviet forces needed in quantities that German forces could not match. The disparity grew wider as the war progressed. German industry struggled with strategic bombing, resource shortages, and the diffusion of effort across multiple incompatible weapon systems. Soviet industry concentrated on proven designs, accepted lower quality, and prioritized quantity. The approach reflected Soviet strategic culture, which valued mass over finesse and accepted crude effectiveness as superior to sophisticated failure. Allied aid to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease requires acknowledgement without minimization or exaggeration. The United States and Britain provided trucks, jeeps, aircraft, food, raw materials, machine tools, and other supplies that arrived through dangerous convoy routes and overland through Iran. The material was significant. Trucks in particular mattered because Soviet industry had focused on tanks and artillery rather than logistics vehicles. American trucks motorized Soviet infantry divisions, supplied forward units, and enabled the operational mobility that characterized Red Army offensives from 1944 onward. Food shipments reduced the burden on Soviet agriculture and freed labor for military and industrial work. Aviation fuel, aluminum, and high-grade steel supplemented Soviet production and improved quality of domestically manufactured equipment. This aid was substantial and important. It was not decisive in the sense that the Soviet Union would have collapsed without it, but it was meaningful in the sense that Soviet operations would have been slower, more difficult, and more costly without it. The relationship between Allied aid and Soviet victory is best understood as interactive rather than determinative. Soviet forces did the fighting and dying. Soviet cities were destroyed. Soviet civilians starved. Soviet industry was bombed, dismantled, evacuated, and rebuilt. The war was won on Soviet soil with Soviet blood. Allied aid made that victory less costly and faster to achieve, which mattered enormously to the people enduring the war, but did not substitute for Soviet effort. Western Allied operations in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France drew German forces away from the Eastern Front and forced Germany to maintain defensive capacity in the West that could not be deployed east. The combined bomber offensive damaged German production and tied down Luftwaffe fighters in air defense roles. These contributions were real and valuable. They were also insufficient to prevent Soviet victory or necessary to enable it. The Eastern Front remained the primary theatre where German military power was broken through attrition, encirclement, and relentless offensive pressure. The Soviet offensives from 1943 onward demonstrated learning, adaptation, and increasingly sophisticated operational planning. The Kursk battle in July 1943 showed Soviet commanders implementing defense in depth, allowing German attacks to exhaust themselves against prepared positions before launching counteroffensives. The defense absorbed German armored thrusts that had broken Soviet lines in previous years. Soviet armor reserves remained uncommitted until German attacks stalled, then struck against weakened sectors. The subsequent Soviet offensives toward Kharkov and into eastern Ukraine recaptured territory and inflicted casualties that Germany could not replace. Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 destroyed German Army Group Center through coordinated assaults that encircled and annihilated entire divisions. The scale and speed of Bagration matched German achievements in 1941, but applied with Soviet mass and improved coordination. Belarusia was liberated in weeks. German forces fell back toward Poland in disorder. The advance into Eastern Europe in 1944 and 1945 was driven by momentum, revenge, exhaustion, and the approaching end of the war. Soviet soldiers who had survived years of combat entered territories where German occupation had been brutal. The desire for retribution was powerful and often expressed through violence against German civilians. Rape, looting, and murder accompanied the Soviet advance, particularly in East Prussia and Pomerania. Soviet military authorities made minimal effort to prevent these crimes. Stalin's attitude was that soldiers who had fought their way across the devastation of their own country had earned the right to take revenge. The official line remained disciplined, but enforcement was lax. German civilians fled westward in millions, attempting to reach zones that would be occupied by Western allies rather than Soviet forces. The flight was often fatal. Columns were strafed, shelled, or overrun. The human cost of the war's final phase was appalling on all sides. The Red Army that reached Berlin in April 1945 was unrecognizable from the force that had collapsed in 1941. It was massive, mechanized, and experienced. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support had improved dramatically. Logistics functioned well enough to sustain offensives hundreds of kilometers deep. Communications were reliable. Commanders operated with confidence born from 3 years of successful operations. The Berlin operation was costly but methodical. Soviet forces encircled the city, reduced it sector by sector, and accepted the casualties required to finish the war. German forces defending Berlin included regular army units, Waffen-SS formations, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth. Resistance was fierce in some areas, negligible in others. The Red Army advanced through city fighting that resembled Stalingrad, but with vastly greater resources and firepower. By May, organized German resistance ended. Victory meant survival, not triumph. The Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany, but at costs that devastated Soviet society for generations. The dead numbered in the tens of millions. Cities were ruins. Agriculture was shattered. Infrastructure was destroyed. The demographic damage was catastrophic. An entire generation of young men had been killed. Women outnumbered men so drastically that normal family formation became impossible for millions. The psychological damage was incalculable. Soldiers returned home to find families dead, villages destroyed, and a state that demanded silence about suffering in favor of celebration of victory. The Great Patriotic War became the central myth of Soviet legitimacy, the story that justified everything the state had done and would do. Questioning the narrative became impossible. The costs were acknowledged only in aggregate, never individually. The state counted victories and liberated cities, not orphans and widows. Stalin's position after the war was stronger than ever. He had led the Soviet Union to victory against the most powerful military machine in Europe. The Red Army occupied Eastern Europe. Soviet influence extended into the heart of Germany. The purges, famines, and terrors of the pre-war period were overshadowed by victory. Stalin used this authority to reimpose control. Soldiers who had seen the West were viewed with suspicion. Prisoners of war who returned to Soviet control were interrogated, accused of collaboration, and sent to camps. Populations from occupied territories faced collective punishment for alleged cooperation with Germans. Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, and other groups were deported en masse to Central Asia and Siberia. The NKVD resumed operations against suspected dissent. The brief relaxation of controls during the war ended. Soviet society returned to fear, surveillance, and repression, now justified by victory and the coming confrontation with the West. The question of how the Soviet Union survived remains complex because survival depended on multiple overlapping factors, none of which alone would have been sufficient. The state's capacity for coercion forced compliance when ideology failed. Stalin's willingness to accept casualties that would have been politically impossible in democracies enabled operations that broke German forces through attrition. The reframing of the war as national survival rather than ideological struggle mobilized loyalties deeper than Marxism-Leninism could reach. Soviet industrial capacity, evacuated east and maintained under impossible conditions, outproduced German industry despite occupation of crucial regions. Allied aid provided material support that improved Soviet effectiveness without substituting for Soviet effort. German mistakes, including the brutality of occupation policy that turned potential allies into partisans, created resistance that tied down troops and resources. The depth of suffering that Soviet society had already endured before 1941 created a population that could absorb additional suffering without collapse. Each factor interacted with others in ways that created resilience beyond what any single element could provide. Coercion worked because the alternative to fighting Germany was often death at German hands. Industrial production succeeded because workers understood that failure meant not just punishment, but actual destruction of their society. Partisan warfare expanded because German occupation made survival impossible and resistance at least offered agency. The war was survived, not through heroism alone or terror alone or ideology alone, but through combinations of all three under conditions where distinctions between them became meaningless. Soviet soldiers fought because they were ordered to, because they believed in defending their country, because they feared what would happen if they did not, and because running offered no safety. These motivations coexisted and reinforced each other. The Soviet command structure learned from disaster through pragmatic adaptation. Commanders who failed were shot, but those who succeeded were given more resources and broader authority. The decentralization of tactical decision-making to frontline officers improved responsiveness and reduced the paralysis that had characterized 1941. At the same time, strategic direction remained firmly centralized in Stalin's hands and the Stavka. This combination allowed for operational flexibility within strategic rigidity. Commanders could adapt methods while pursuing objectives that were not negotiable. The system was brutal but functional. Officers who delivered results were tolerated despite errors that in peacetime would have been fatal. The margin for failure expanded as Soviet operational effectiveness improved and strategic position strengthened. The role of memory and narrative in sustaining Soviet resistance should not be underestimated. The references to 1812, to Russian military history, to defense of the motherland, connected the war to stories that resonated emotionally even with people who had no attachment to Bolshevism. Stalin understood that pure ideology had limited reach. Most Soviet citizens did not deeply understand dialectical materialism or the theory of class struggle. They did understand invasion, destruction, and the need to protect homes and families. The Great Patriotic War narrative worked because it translated an ideological war into terms that made visceral sense. This was not cynical manipulation by leadership, but rather recognition of what actually motivated human beings under catastrophic stress. The narrative also provided framework for understanding sacrifice. Deaths were not meaningless if they defended something worth defending. The framing helped survivors process losses that otherwise would have been unbearable. Soviet logistics, often dismissed as crude, functioned adequately enough to sustain offensive operations that advanced thousands of kilometers from Stalingrad to Berlin. The system relied on railways, captured equipment, American trucks, horses, and improvisation. Ammunition was stockpiled in massive quantities before offensives. Food was obtained through requisition from occupied areas, supplemented by lend-lease supplies. Medical care was minimal. Wounded soldiers who could walk were patched up and returned to their units. Those who could not were evacuated when possible, or left behind when not. The harshness was not accidental, but reflected priorities. Advancing mattered more than comfort. Completing objectives mattered more than individual survival. The system accepted levels of waste and loss that professional militaries would find intolerable, but it worked within Soviet operational culture, where mass and persistence compensated for efficiency. The transformation of the Soviet population from 1941 to 1945 was more than military. Millions of civilians experienced occupation, partisan warfare, evacuation, or factory work under conditions that blurred distinctions between frontline and home front. Women constituted substantial portions of the workforce in industries and agriculture that kept the Soviet Union functioning. They also served in combat roles as snipers, pilots, tank crews, and infantry. The war forced changes in Soviet society that the revolution had proclaimed but not fully implemented. Traditional gender roles collapsed under necessity. Survival skills that had been developed during collectivization and purges were applied to wartime conditions. The population learned that the state would demand everything and provide minimal protection, but that collective effort could achieve what seemed impossible. The endgame of the war in Europe saw Soviet forces occupying territories that would become the foundation of Soviet influence for the next 4 decades. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Eastern Germany fell under Soviet control. The mechanisms of that control were established through a combination of installed communist governments, secret police operations, and military presence. Soviet forces that had fought through Eastern Europe were not liberators in the sense Western forces presented themselves in France and Italy. They were conquerors whose arrival meant replacement of Nazi occupation with Soviet domination. The local populations often experienced little improvement in conditions. German administration was replaced by Soviet administration. Nazi security services were replaced by NKVD operations. Political opponents were arrested under new ideological justifications, but with familiar methods. The victory celebrations in Moscow in May 1945 marked the end of the war in Europe, but not the end of Soviet military operations. Japan remained at war, and Stalin had promised to enter the Pacific conflict. Soviet forces attacked Japanese positions in Manchuria in August 1945, achieving rapid success against an enemy already facing defeat from American offensives and atomic bombings. The Manchurian operation added territory and influence to Soviet gains, while requiring relatively little effort compared to the European war. The timing ensured Soviet participation in the post-war settlement in Asia and positioned the Soviet Union as a Pacific power. The operation also demonstrated that Soviet operational methods developed against Germany worked equally well against other opponents. The human legacy of the war extended far beyond military casualties and territorial changes. Soviet society had been fundamentally altered by 4 years of total war. The generation that fought returned home, changed by experiences that could not be fully shared or processed. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as PTSD, but was then simply expected to be suppressed. The state offered no counseling, no therapy, no acknowledgement that psychological wounds might require treatment. Veterans were expected to resume normal lives, work in the Reconstruction effort, and support the narrative of glorious victory. Those who struggled with this expectation had few options. Alcoholism became widespread. Violence within families was common. The war's trauma was privatized, pushed into homes and individual consciousness, never collectively addressed. The reconstruction of the Soviet Union proceeded through the same methods that had driven pre-war industrialization: state direction, forced labor, unrealistic quotas, and punishment for failure. German prisoners of war provided labor for rebuilding projects. Camp populations were deployed to mines, logging operations, and construction sites. The civilian population worked under conditions that remained harsh despite peace. Housing shortages were severe. Food remained scarce until agricultural production recovered. Consumer goods were virtually non-existent as industry focused on military equipment and heavy machinery. The standard of living for most Soviet citizens improved only marginally from wartime conditions. The promise that victory would bring better lives went largely unfulfilled. Instead, the population was told that continued sacrifice was necessary to rebuild, to maintain military strength against capitalist enemies, and to achieve socialism. Stalin's final years saw renewed terror. The Leningrad affair targeted party officials in that city. The doctor's plot accused Jewish physicians of conspiring to kill Soviet leaders. Paranoia intensified. The international situation grew more hostile as the Cold War developed. Soviet nuclear weapons development accelerated. The arms race began. The victory over Nazi Germany, rather than bringing security, initiated a new phase of militarization and confrontation. The Soviet Union that had survived Hitler now faced the United States and NATO. The population that had endured Barbarossa now lived under threat of nuclear war. The cycle of fear and mobilization continued without pause. The question of Soviet survival is ultimately a question about human capacity to endure. The Soviet population in 1941 had already survived revolution, civil war, famine, collectivization, and terror. These experiences had created a population hardened to suffering, suspicious of outsiders, obedient to authority through fear, and capable of functioning under conditions that would destroy societies that had not been similarly tested. When Nazi Germany invaded, it encountered not a normal society, but a society that had been forged through decades of violence into something that could absorb violence and continue functioning. This was not strength in any admirable sense, but rather the grim reality that extreme suffering had become normalized. The Soviet state had brutalized its own population so thoroughly that when an external enemy attempted to destroy that population, the capacity to resist was already present. The mechanisms of survival combined state coercion, national identity mobilization, industrial production, Allied support, German mistakes, and human endurance in proportions that varied by time and place, but together created conditions where defeat was never inevitable despite catastrophic losses. The Soviet Union survived because it could replace casualties faster than Germany could inflict them, produce equipment faster than it was destroyed, and maintain control over population and territory through methods that Western democracies could not employ. The survival came at costs that exceeded the war's material destruction. Soviet society emerged from the war traumatized, depleted, and subjected to renewed repression. Victory secured survival but not freedom, security but not prosperity, power but not justice. The war's legacy shaped Soviet identity and policy for the remainder of the Soviet Union's existence. The Great Patriotic War became the unquestionable achievement, the moment when Soviet power was validated through blood sacrifice and military victory. No criticism of Soviet leadership could overcome the fact that Stalin had led the country to victory against Hitler. No discussion of purges, famines, or camps could compete with the memory of defeating fascism. The war legitimized everything else. It became the foundation of Soviet claims to international respect, to control over Eastern Europe, to continued sacrifice from the population. The victory was real, the suffering was real, and the state used both to maintain power for decades after the guns fell silent. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.